Instead of focusing on winning arguments, we're teaching the basic fundamentals of sales and marketing and how we can use them to win in the world of politics, teaching you how to meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Welcome to the Brian Nichols Show. Well, happy Monday there, folks. Brian Nichols here on the Brian Nichols Show, and thank you for joining us on, of course, another fun-filled episode. I am, as always, your humble host, and today I am excited to have this conversation because to you men out there, you fellow men, this is a conversation to you and for you, frankly, and it is what's happening to us. But before we get there, we're going to go ahead and give a shout out to today's sponsor, and that is the Expat Money Show. Now, if you head over to briannicholsshow.com/expat, you're going to go ahead and not only check out this awesome podcast from our good friend Mikkel Thorpe that focuses on how to protect the money that you've worked so hard to earn from those ambulance-chasing lawyers, nefarious creditors, and greedy, unjust governments, but also you can sign up for the amazing free virtual summit taking place November 7th through November 11th. It is the Expat Money Summit. And breaking news, I cannot believe I get the opportunity to even say this. The one, the only Ron Paul will be one of the keynote speakers here for the Expat Money Summit. So head over to briannicholsshow.com/expat and make sure you can not only join our good friend Mikkel Thorpe, but also find how he helps people just like you invest internationally, secure second passports and residencies, eliminate your tax bill, and take advantage of offshore structures so you can travel the world freely and never have to worry about money again. And oh yes, one more time, that virtual summit, it is free, briannicholsshow.com/expat. All right, folks, so on to the program today. I'm excited to have this conversation because, frankly, men, it's time for us to have this conversation because there's been a lot of issues taking place, especially us gents here in America. So joining us on the program today, Cathy Reisenwitz. Welcome to the Brian Nichols Show.
Hey, Brian. So good to be here.
I'm so happy to have you, Cathy. Thank you for joining us because we're talking about a very serious issue, and that is men out there. There have been issues that have been plaguing men across the left and right, it seems, for the past 20, 30 years. It's been getting exponentially worse, whether you're looking at the way that men interact with their partners, the way that men interact in sexual relationships, the way men have interacted with their occupations and what their role is in society. We've seen really across the board a redefining or maybe a lack of defining of what it means to be a guy, be a man in America or in the world today. Cathy, I know you have some perspectives and some thoughts there, but before we get there, do us a favor, introduce yourself to the Brian Nichols Show audience.
Absolutely. So I'm Cathy Reisenwitz, and I am a writer, activist, and OnlyFans creator. I have a newsletter called Sex in the State. You can find it at cathyreisenwitz.substack.com. I'm on OF at of.com/Cathy Reisenwitz, and I've been in the libertarian sphere for many years now. I've written for Fee and Reason and many other outlets. And my main focus is obviously government oppression, but I'm also particularly interested in matters of sex and gender.
As I'm taking a drink of my water, I apologize. So let's talk about sex and gender, right? This is an area right now, and let's talk about men specifically, where we're seeing there's been a big split in conversation in terms of, well, what does it mean to be a guy? And this is, I think, actually been peeking its head for the past few years. I teased that a little bit in the intro, that your average guy doesn't really know what it means to be a guy. And I've seen this in some of the people I've been friends with over the years. And, you know, it's frankly some guys that have fallen out of my friend's circle because they themselves are so insecure in what it means to be a guy that they don't know how to really have those relationships, to have sometimes uncomfortable conversations. And we get into this world where a lot of men put on the bubble. They get into their own, you know, kind of zone, and they do their own thing, and they live with their issues. They live with their problems, and they don't talk about it with anybody else. So talk to me, Cathy. What's the issues that you've been seeing, and where are you seeing men maybe starting to look for some help in areas that they haven't been looking for help in ways in the past?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated, interrelated issue. But one of the things that I've really noticed is that the kind of standard of a male breadwinner marriage is becoming less and less feasible over time. So several trends are playing into this. One is women's labor force participation rates and average wages are growing, while men's labor force participation rates are declining and low, and their wages have been stagnant. The bottom 75% of men in terms of income, their wages have been stagnant since the 1970s. And meanwhile, cost disease means that the cost of our biggest expenditures, housing, education, healthcare, things like that, are increasing. And so it's going to be impossible, in other words, in the near future, and already it is impossible for a lot of Americans to have a male breadwinner model of marriage. And so essentially, when you have low and declining labor force participation rates, so that means, for a cohort of American native-born men from roughly like 18 to 30, there's something like 20% of men who are just called NEET, which means not in education, employment, or training. So, how do we get these men into the labor force? And then, how do we make marriage happen? And how do we redefine masculinity in light of these macroeconomic changes? So these are some of the things that I'm kind of grappling with. And then also the knock-on effects of these macroeconomic changes. And then another thing that I think is really playing into this is that demand for male-coded labor is low and declining, and demand for feminine-coded labor is increasing. And all this is just going to make it ever more difficult to maintain the male breadwinner model of marriage. And so, how do we get these men out of their homes, into jobs, into marriages, and into a model of masculinity that is healthy and workable in the new economic reality?
And I guess it goes also back to what's the role of a guy going forward, right? Like, and you talked about it because this is kind of how it used to just be, right? Men were the breadwinners, women were at home with the kids. That was life. And things have changed. So I think not only things have changed, but I think, to your point, they're changing so quickly that now we're seeing almost institutional roles change to the point that a lot of men are still. Look, we just had our last Band of Brothers D-Day survivor pass away from World War II. He's like 102 years old. So to think, what was his, back when he was a kid, what was it to be a man versus to where he ended up passing away in 2022, what it is to be a man today. And you can see, there's a lot of ambiguity in between from where he was to where we are today. So it's hard for even men today to look to other men to ask, what does it mean to be a man? Because you're going to get so many different answers.
Right. And there was at one time, roughly from like the 50s to the 70s, where the model of masculinity was pretty clear cut. You got a job and you found a wife and you provided for your family financially. That was a time when demand for manufacturing and agricultural labor was very high. The demand for jobs where the biggest attribute you can bring is physical strength and stamina, the demand for that labor is much lower than it was then, and it is only declining. And so it used to be that a low skill man could expect to have a job that could provide for a wife and family and buy him a car or 2 cars and a house without a college degree and without any special skills. That time is over. That's not true anymore. And so how do we redefine masculinity and change our systems in such a way that low skill, low education men have a place in society?
Let me ask you this, Cathy. Do you, and I see as a guy, I think that there's absolutely a bent against men in many cases in the way that men are approached in society. And I think it's tough because a lot of men just don't feel comfortable in raising this as a concern because of the narrative and the approach of, well, you've had it great for so long. Oh, the patriarchal man. Oh, you mansplaining. Like all those almost just rejections have now turned into realities for millions of men. So what are you seeing as a means to maybe help engage men into the conversation? Because frankly, I've heard and I've seen that's partly why a lot of men keep to themselves, is because they don't want the social beratement. They don't want to feel that they're being a nuisance, but at the same point in time, they're looking for help and they're not sure if they're going to get it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of why I started this project, is because I see a lot of conversation around what's happening to men, from like two equally unhelpful sides. The one side kind of tries to deny reality, and say, oh, men just need to be men, or, we just need to promote marriage, or, men just need to work harder. And it's like, well, no, there are structural forces in play that are keeping men, or at least making it more difficult for men, to lead the lives that their fathers and grandfathers led. And then from the other side, I see a lot of, yeah, like you're saying, like, men have it easy, men have an advantage, men are too advantaged in society. And it's like, well, that's true in certain ways. There are certain ways in which men are absolutely still advantaged in society, but it's not uniform, right? Like, they're not advantaged first in every aspect of society, certainly. And much more importantly, there's a certain class and kind of man that is much more uniformly advantaged in our society. But there's a whole bunch of men who don't really get to benefit from those advantages. And so I'm trying to look at it from like neither unhelpful frame, and try to look at it from a more comprehensive, accurate frame. And I think, one thing that we want to do is like stop, denying reality, as far as, yes, it is, I think, still on net a privilege in America to be born male, but that doesn't mean everything is going to be handed to you. It doesn't mean there are no circumstances in which it is unhelpful to be born male bodied. And so, to just look at the totality of what's going on. And, I just want to stop the conversation from being men versus women. Like, I think that's completely unhelpful, and say, how do we all come together and find where society is failing men, so we can all thrive.
Yeah, well, and what you're asking for is nuance. You're asking for empathy, and frankly, that is something that is so not only necessary for this conversation, but it's so often rejected from the conversation that you see why there is such a schism, and why this has been such a difficult conversation for so many folks to take part in. And frankly, it also leads to why we see so many of the issues that we see, where you'll have a tough guy, strong man, or at least the caricature, right? The perception of what the tough guy, look at Trump. That is exactly what Trump, he represented, was this idealistic guy, and what every guy could pursue, like in life. You could be the billionaire with all the women and the fancy cars and all the buildings with your name on it, and that's what it meant to be a guy. But that's not what it means to be a guy. And frankly, is Trump really, solid in his own masculinity? I wouldn't think so. You see the way he approaches a lot of very masculine issues, and he gets very weary on it. So you can even see he doesn't even buy his own BS, Cathy. So I think it's important, especially on a lot of guys out there, to almost take the stand and reclaim, to your point, what does it mean to be a man? And let me ask you this, because you'll see the flip side. You almost see, and pardon the expression, the betification of a lot of guys, where it's been pushed for men to embrace and accept these roles that they've been almost pushed into, regardless if they like it or not. Whether, and that is a conversation, I think, right there, that, hey, let's have that conversation. What do you want to do? Let's figure out what you want to do. But because a lot of men have just so much abdicated any of that kind of sense of direction, they just assume these roles. And I guess, is that maybe one of the things we should be looking against, is men who just kind of accept life, accept whatever role is thrust upon them, and it makes them, I don't want to say less of a man, but at least it gives them less of a say in what it means for them to be a man.
Yeah, absolutely. I think masculinity is under attack, both from the left and the right. I think that it's under attack from the left in pretty obvious ways, but I think it's under attack from the right in the kinds of things you're bringing up, that it redefines masculinity in a very selfish, boorish, rude, negative way, right? Like, Trump should not represent masculinity for anyone. And so I think that, if we're going to have masculinity be physical strength and stamina, full stop, that's just not very useful in the modern economy and in the modern world. But I think that if we're going to focus on the aspects of masculinity like personal sacrifice, like bravery, like competitiveness, like a certain amount of aggression, right? These are things that are still very useful in the market economy and in the world today. I think, a certain abdication of self, a certain willingness to sacrifice is something that is a healthy masculinity. And it's interesting that when you look at immigrant men, you see a much higher rates of marriage and labor force participation.
Mm.
And what you often see is that immigrant men are more willing than native born men to take whatever kinds of jobs are available to them and to enter into marriages before they have a certain level of economic security and work with their wives to work up into that place of economic security, as opposed to either giving up or waiting until they're quote unquote ready to get married. And so these are some of the things that I think we need to have conversations about. There's a certain amount of, quote unquote, feminizing that probably a lot of men will have to do, because the jobs of the future require emotional maturity and intelligence and patience and the ability to sit still and things that traditionally men are not socialized to be great at. But there are aspects of masculinity that I think will always be useful in society. And I'd like to see our culture prop up and teach men about those aspects of masculinity instead of just being like a big, strong brute, right? That's just not that useful anymore.
No. Well, I mean, right. It's your point. That's not useful anymore. Is it a component? I do think, it is important for men to at least be physically fit and healthy, because I can say that as a guy. I used to weigh 385, right? I was a big boy, and I know, and I can objectively state, life is infinitely better now versus when I was a big boy. And the reason being is because not only am I more confident in my abilities, right, but also then I can almost personify that confidence. I can live and breathe that confidence versus before it was just I was always living in a shell. And this is true for anybody, by the way. If you're looking to get healthy, like, I cannot encourage you enough to please improve your physical well-being, because it's going to pay the dividends in the long run. But to your point, it's not just to go and lift weights until you're a big meathead and that's all you based your identity on. Just the same thing we talk about our libertarian friends. The whole point is not to become a libertarian and be the best version of libertarian self. It's to be the best version of a well-rounded self. And how important is it to actually be a true, well-rounded individual? And I think what you're speaking to, Cathy, and this is something that we see this in all great societies, is that you take the things that every single person can bring a value to the table, and you use those things together in tandem. So it's the things that men can do well. You mentioned the certain things like sacrifice, consistency, the aggression, even the little bit of aggression, right? That is important to help move things along, but also the feminine side, that you need to have the empathy, the understanding, the kindness, and being able to bridge those worlds together. I mean, look at Gary Vee. I don't care if people love him or hate him. He's become one of the most successful entrepreneurs out there because he has embraced this unique sense of Gary Vee masculinity that is very focused, driven, intensity, but at the same time, like passion, empathy, understanding, and that has made him to have a superpower. And if more men can embrace that kind of superpower, I dare say, Cathy, a lot of the problems that we're identifying today, they'd be solved in a heartbeat, because now men would start to find there's more to life than what you think is just the sexual desires, or just the physical desires, or the financial desires, whatever those little things you've set to be the things that you must accomplish in order to check the box of being a man, that you realize there's so much more to that. And that really, with there's so much more that there is to look at, there's so much more value you can go and enjoy from.
Totally. And I think that, this project and this whole thing is absolutely not about saying, men are useless and masculinity is useless. Like, not at all. I think men are wonderful, and I think masculinity is wonderful. I just think that there is opportunity to evolve masculinity. I think we've done an amazing job as a society of evolving femininity, right? The definition and there's so many ways that women can talk about and tailor femininity to our goals and what serves us. And that's what I think these constructs should do. We shouldn't serve femininity or masculinity. Our conceptions of femininity and masculinity should serve us. And so I think we've had a cultural script and a cultural movement around evolving femininity to better serve women. And I just think that men need the same thing. Like, how do we evolve the scripts and expectations and narratives around masculinity in such a way that it's serving men?
Amen. Well, Cathy, unfortunately, we're already in the back half of the episode, meaning I want to make sure we obviously point folks the right way towards being able to learn more about all the great work you're doing to help continue this conversation, but also they can go ahead and financially support you because you have a Substack. It's Sex in the State. Talk to us about that.
Absolutely. So I'm exploring these issues and more with political screeds and personal essays at Sex and the State. So you can Google that, or you can go to cathyreisenwitz.substack.com. That is CathyReisenwitz. And if you want to follow my thoughts on a regular basis, I'm also very active on Twitter. So that's at Cathy Reisenwitz. And if you want to financially support me and see me naked, I am onlyfans.com/Cathy Reisenwitz. Thank you so much for letting me talk about my stuff and my thoughts and having me on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And I bet the audience didn't expect that last one. If you want to see you naked, well, there you go. That's a Brian Nichols Show exclusive, and probably the first time you'll ever hear that here on the program. So with that being said, yes, no, folks, thank you so much for joining us, Cathy. And folks, if you enjoyed today's episode, I'm going to ask you, please do me a favor. Go ahead and give today's episode a share. And hey, I'm going to challenge you. If you're a guy listening to this episode and this kind of hit home to you, well, number one, please let me know. Email me, brian@briannicholsshow.com. But number two, I would love it if you reach out to Cathy, give her a note, tell her that you really appreciate her appearing. I know folks love to hear from guests, or rather hear from the audience when they're guests here in the Brian Nichols Show. So please go ahead, reach out to Cathy and tell her that you really appreciate her words, and go ahead and learn more. Go ahead, support her Substack, and obviously go ahead and follow her at all the different mediums, Twitter, OnlyFans, wherever it may be. And folks, thank you for joining us on today's episode. With that being said, did you check out our awesome conversation last week? We talked about Text It. Yeah, Text It. Make sure you go ahead. I'll include that link right here below for you YouTube watcher. I'll see you over there. But with that being said, it's Brian Nichols signing off here on the Brian Nichols Show for Cathy Reisenwitz. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks for listening to the Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.